The British royal family has survived wars, abdications, and scandals that would have destroyed lesser institutions. But there is one voice they could never silence, and in 2026, that voice is finally being heard. Princess Diana recorded 5 hours of secret tapes. What's on them is about to change everything. To understand why these tapes matter, you have to go back to a moment that most people have forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood. It is 1991. Diana is 30 years old. She has been Princess of Wales for a decade. From the outside, she is the most photographed woman on the planet, the jewel of the monarchy, a mother of 2 future kings. She attends charity galas and shakes hands with world leaders. She appears on the covers of magazines from London to Tokyo. Every movement she makes is documented by photographers camping outside every door she walks through. Every dress she wears becomes international news before the night is over. She is, in the eyes of the watching world, the living embodiment of a fairy tale that people had been waiting their whole lives to believe in. People named their daughters after her. People saved newspaper clippings of her wedding for decades. People saw in her something they desperately wanted to be true about the world. That beauty and kindness and goodness could win out, that a girl from an ordinary background could be chosen, elevated, loved, and that the story would end the way it was supposed to end. But inside Kensington Palace, behind the polished doors and the perfectly managed public appearances and the careful choreography of a life lived entirely in public view, Diana is living a private nightmare that the world has absolutely no idea about. Her marriage is collapsing. Her husband is deeply, genuinely, permanently in love with another woman, a woman he has been in love with since long before Diana ever entered the picture. The institution Diana married into at just 20 years old, an institution that was supposed to be her family and her protection, has turned cold and indifferent toward her in ways she could not have anticipated when she was standing at the altar of St. Paul's Cathedral in that extraordinary dress, watched by 750 million people around the world. The people who were supposed to support her have chosen their loyalty to the crown over any loyalty to her as a human being. And she is, in every meaningful sense, completely alone. But Diana was never passive. She was never simply the tragic figure the media would later try to make her into. The beautiful victim, the lost princess, the woman who was too gentle and too sensitive for the brutal world she had been dropped into. That portrait was always a profound distortion of who she actually was. Diana was strategic. She was deeply intelligent. She read people with a precision that often startled those around her. She understood power, how it worked, who held it, and how it could be shifted when you moved carefully enough. And she understood one thing better than almost anyone else inside that palace ever understood it: that information is power, that narratives can be controlled, but only so long as the right people are holding them. So she did something remarkable. She sat down inside her private apartment at Kensington Palace, and she talked for hours and hours, candidly, openly, without a filter, and without a team of palace advisors standing over her shoulder, coaching her on what to say and what to carefully omit. Into a recorder, held by her close and deeply trusted friend, Dr. James Colthurst, who would then deliver those recordings secretly to a journalist named Andrew Morton. Those tapes became the foundation of Morton's explosive 1992 biography, Diana, Her True Story, the book that shook the British monarchy to its very foundations and forced the world to confront a version of royal life that the palace had worked extraordinarily hard to keep hidden from public sight for years. But here is what almost nobody knew until now. Morton only used a small fraction of what Diana actually recorded. Less than 1 hour of those 5 hours of tape has ever been heard publicly in the 35 years since Diana sat down and spoke the truth into that recorder. The rest, 4 hours and more of unheard, unedited, entirely raw recordings in Diana's own voice, were locked away, hidden from the public, kept from the world while Diana's image was managed, mythologized, and in many ways carefully sanitized to fit whatever narrative the various interested parties needed her to serve at any given moment in the years following her death. Now, in 2026, that silence is finally ending. A new docuseries called Diana, The Unheard Truth, is preparing to release those recordings to the world. And what Diana says on those tapes, about Charles, about Camilla, about the royal family, about her own mental health, about the future she was determined to build for herself, is being described by those who have already had access to the material as nothing short of extraordinary. Let us start with the woman who sits at the center of all of this. Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, has spent decades navigating a level of public hostility that would have broken most people entirely. She has survived a reputation that was constructed almost entirely in opposition to Diana's, as the villain in a love story that I'm fallen on Earth. Public had already decided the ending of before any of the key characters had a fair chance to speak. For years, the British public simply could not find it in themselves to forgive her. She was the other woman. She was the one who had been there, in the background, throughout the entirety of Charles' marriage to Diana, and who had refused to disappear, even as that marriage visibly deteriorated in front of the watching world. She was blamed for the collapse of what had seemed like the fairy tale of the century. She was followed by photographers and hounded by the press. She was pelted with bread rolls when she attempted to do something as ordinary as grocery shopping. She changed her telephone number repeatedly because of the sheer volume of hate mail that kept finding its way to her. She could barely appear anywhere in public without hostility following close behind. And through all of it, year after year, Camilla endured. She stayed quiet. She maintained her composure in the face of treatment that most people would find unbearable. She stayed close to Charles. She gave very few interviews and made very few public statements that might provide the press with additional ammunition. And she waited with a patience that, looking back on it now from the distance of decades, was itself a kind of extraordinary and quietly underappreciated achievement. Time, as it always does, eventually shifted the picture. The years passed. Diana's death in 1997 transformed the public grief into something enormous and permanent, but it also gradually began to allow for a more complicated and more honest understanding of the entire situation. Charles and Camilla married in April 2005. The public reaction was cautious and guarded, but the sky did not fall, and the monarchy survived intact. And Camilla, through decades of steady and largely unglamorous public service, showing up consistently, doing the work, not making headlines for the wrong reasons, began to build something that had seemed genuinely impossible in the weeks after Diana's funeral. She built goodwill. Not the wild, passionate public adoration that Diana had inspired and that had transformed grief into a collective national experience in 1997, but something quieter and perhaps ultimately more durable. A grudging and eventually genuine respect from a public that had once wanted nothing to do with her. By 2023, The Independent had named Camilla the most influential woman in Britain. Her name appeared on that same list again in 2024 and 2025 and 2026. She had completed one of the most remarkable public rehabilitations in the modern history of the British monarchy. But what did Diana actually think of Camilla? Not the tabloid version, not the carefully managed quote stripped of its full context and deployed in service of a predetermined headline, but the real, unfiltered, deeply private thoughts of a woman speaking alone into a recorder, inside her own home, believing with every reasonable expectation she had at the time that these particular words would never be heard in full by the world. That is exactly what these tapes are promising to deliver. And those who have already had access to the recordings say the answer is far more nuanced, far more powerful, and far more deeply human than anyone who has spent years consuming the simplified tabloid version of this story could have predicted. The production company behind the docuseries, Love Monday, has described Diana's words as those of a woman who was navigating extraordinary and relentless pressure, actively redefining her role on her own terms, and moving forward with a conviction that the people around her almost entirely failed to recognize. They say viewers will hear Diana's dreams for a future that could have been, a version of the future in which Charles does indeed go off into the sunset with Camilla. And Diana is finally free to carve her own path without carrying the enormous weight of an institution that had never truly wanted her outside of the very specific ceremonial function they had designed for her. Viewers, they say, will be genuinely astounded to hear how accurately Diana predicted what would actually happen. Think about what that means. In 1991, sitting in her apartment at Kensington Palace at 30 years old, Diana outlined a future for herself and a future for Charles and Camilla that turned out to be almost exactly what reality then delivered. She saw it coming clearly. She spoke it out loud. She put it on tape. And then reality unfolded almost precisely as she had described it, except that Diana herself never got to live the chapter she had imagined for herself. To fully understand the weight of these tapes, you have to understand the specific history Diana was living through when she recorded them. By 1991, the relationship between Charles and Camilla was not simply a rumor confined to quiet whispers among courtiers and palace insiders. It was an open secret among senior royals, their household staff, their social circle, and large sections of the British press who possessed the information but were choosing, for various complicated reasons involving access and palace relationships, not to print it yet. What it was not in 1991 was public knowledge in the fullest and most undeniable sense. That explosion was still building. Diana knew all of it. She had known for years. She had been living with the weight of this knowledge, carrying it largely alone, trying to process what it meant for her marriage, for her children, for her future, for her sense of herself as a human being. In fact, according to multiple accounts that have surfaced over the decades, Diana had even confronted Camilla directly about the affair as far back as 1989. That confrontation reportedly happened at a birthday party at the home of a mutual friend. Diana pulled Camilla aside and told her plainly, with a composure that surprised everyone present, that she was fully and completely aware of exactly what was going on between Camilla and her husband. By all accounts, it was a moment of extraordinary personal courage from a woman who had been systematically made to feel invisible inside her own marriage and inside the institution that was supposed to be her family. What followed in the years after Diana made those recordings was a cascade of events that would permanently and irreversibly alter the landscape of the British monarchy. In 1992, Morton's book was published and caused a genuine national earthquake. The private world Diana had been speaking about, the profound loneliness, the coldness, the indifference of the people around her, her mental health struggles, the collapse of her marriage, became public and suddenly undeniable. The palace was furious. Charles Camp was furious. The British establishment, which had spent years carefully constructing and maintaining a particular image of the royal family as a stable, admirable, and morally reliable institution, watched helplessly as that image fractured in real time in the hands of readers across the country who were consuming Morton's book and recognizing that the story they had been told about the royal family was deeply, seriously incomplete. Then, in January 1993, came the scandal that became permanently known as Camillagate, a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded in December 1989 by an amateur radio enthusiast who stumbled onto the call while testing a new electronic scanning device, was published in full by the Sunday People and the Sunday Mirror. The content of that call was deeply intimate, explicitly personal, and profoundly embarrassing to the Crown. It revealed not just that the affair was ongoing, but that Charles' entire social world, his closest friends and their country estates, were actively helping him conduct it, organizing meeting points and providing cover across a network of aristocratic connections. Diana described the contents as sick. The British public, already shaken by the Morton book, was now confronted with the full and undeniable reality of what had been happening behind closed palace doors for years. Charles and Diana formally separated in 1992. Their divorce was finalized in 1996. Diana died in a Paris tunnel in August 1997, just over a year after the divorce was complete. She was 36 years old. The outpouring of public grief that followed her death was unlike anything Britain had seen in living memory. Millions of flowers were piled outside Kensington Palace until the iron gates disappeared beneath them. People stood in enormous queues for hours simply to sign books of condolence. A nation wept collectively in a way that shocked even those who had anticipated a large response. And at Diana's funeral, it was her brother, Charles Spenser, the 9th Earl Spenser, who stood up and delivered a eulogy that sent a direct and publicly broadcast rebuke to both the royal family and to the press, a speech that people who witnessed it still describe, nearly 30 years later, as among the most powerful pieces of spoken language they have ever heard delivered in a public setting in their lifetimes. Spenser spoke of his sister as a woman who received no meaningful support from the family she married into, who was then systematically pursued and ultimately destroyed by a press that treated her as a commodity rather than as a person. He spoke directly to her sons William and Harry, sitting in the front pews of Westminster Abbey, and made a pledge to them about what their mother's blood family intended to do to protect them from suffering in the ways she had suffered. It was a speech that made senior members of the royal family visibly uncomfortable in front of the watching world. And it established Charles Spenser, definitively and permanently, as someone who had chosen his sister and her memory over any obligation to institutional loyalty or royal convenience. The people behind Diana? The unheard truth are Andrew Morton himself and Dr. James Colthurst, the man who held the recorder in Kensington Palace in 1991. These are the people who were personally entrusted with Diana's words. They were there. They made the decision, 35 years later, that the complete record deserved to finally be heard. Not the edited portion, not the fraction deemed safe enough to publish in 1992. All of it. The docuseries runs across 3 parts and features not just Diana's voice, but the voices of people who were genuinely close to her. Hairdresser Sam McKnight, astrologer Penny Thornton, journalist and close confidant Richard Kay, Royal Press Secretary Dickie Arbiter, and longtime bodyguard Ken Worf. Together, they are assembling what they describe as the most complete portrait of who Diana actually was, as a living, complex, fully human person that has ever been made available to the public. What they are promising is not a comfortable rehash of the stories everyone already knows. They are promising real revelations, new material. Diana's voice speaking about Charles and Camilla in ways that have never been aired publicly because they were considered too raw or too specific for release, while certain people still had something significant to protect. Diana speaking about her sons, now grown men navigating painful and very public relationships with the institution their mother spent a decade struggling to survive inside. Diana speaking about Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, a couple whose own catastrophically public unraveling ran in painful and eerie parallel to Diana's own story and whose entanglement with the palace machinery and the press followed the same brutal logic. Diana speaking about her own mental health with a candor that went further than anything Morton included in 1992, touching on territory that was considered far too sensitive and far too damaging to put into a book that would land in the hands of millions of readers who were not prepared for that level of honesty from a member of the royal family. And most powerfully of all, Diana speaking about what she wanted her own future to look like, the chapter she was planning in 1991, the life she was designing in her imagination, while the walls of her marriage were falling down around her, the woman she was determined to become once she was finally completely, irreversibly free. There is something almost unbearable about that dimension of the tapes. Here is a woman who, in 1991, was still young, still at what she genuinely believed was only the beginning of a long and eventually free second act. She is planning. She is dreaming out loud. She is describing a version of herself that she was fighting with everything she had to become: freer, more autonomous, more completely and unapologetically honest, no longer squeezed into the shape that an institution had decided she must occupy. She is describing a world in which Charles is with Camilla, which is what he had always wanted, and she is no longer required to stand in the way of that. In her mind, in 1991, that was not a defeat. It was a door opening. And then, 6 years later, before she had ever fully walked through that door into the life she had imagined for herself, she was gone, taken from the world in a Paris tunnel at 36 years old, leaving behind 2 sons, millions of people who loved her, and 5 hours of tape that the world had never fully been allowed to hear. What does Camilla make of all this, sitting now as queen at the very summit of British public life, bearing a title that would have seemed like a cruel impossibility in 1997? Whatever Diana said about her on those tapes, whatever private, unguarded, completely unfiltered assessment Diana made of the woman who occupied such a central and painful role in the story of her marriage, is about to become part of the permanent public record in a way that no palace communications team can manage, shape, or contain. Those who have heard the recordings say Diana's perspective is more complex than simple anger or bitterness, but nuance is not the same as absence of feeling, and complexity is not the same as forgiveness. Diana did not speak diplomatically when she was speaking, privately into that recorder. She spoke plainly. She named names. She described specific conversations, specific moments, and specific betrayals with a precision and directness that her carefully managed public image never fully revealed to the world. This is ultimately what Diana understood better than anyone around her: that silence is never neutral, that when powerful institutions control the narrative, the people those institutions have hurt get quietly and systematically erased from the official version of events. She refused to be erased. She sat in that apartment in 1991 and made absolutely certain that her truth would exist somewhere in the world, even if she had no control over exactly when it would surface or who would be alive and present to hear it when it finally did. 35 years later, it is surfacing. The voice is Diana's. The words are hers. The truth she chose to tell, in her own time, in her own way, to the only people she trusted enough with the full weight of it, that truth is finally coming to the world she spoke for. The tapes are real. The voice is Diana's, and the story, at long and overdue last, belongs entirely to her.